Although we've learned a lot about Egypt scientifically over the last 150 years, a lot of it still doesn't make a whole lot of sense. For instance, Egypt arose very suddenly. It arose out of basically nothing, herders and tribesmen, within 50 years. All of the symbols, the language, and the religion was there from day one, apparently in an incredible burst of creativity. They built all the amazing monuments at the very beginning of their civilization. The large granite temples, the pyramids, they're all from the Old Kingdom, the very beginning of dynastic Egypt. But then, after this amazing burst of creativity, Egypt completely stagnated. Change was absolutely forbidden. Although Egypt is thought of commonly as one continuous civilization spanning thousands of years, actually it collapsed several times, reverting to barbarism, only to begin again with all of the symbols and religion intact. It's very odd. It consists of three civilizations that just happen to look similar. The Old Kingdom, which is from the Pyramid times, the New Kingdom, which is when Akhenaten and Tutankhamun were pharaoh, and then there's the late period we associate with Cleopatra. And remember from the TV show Mystery of the Sphinx, the Egyptologists mocking the notion of so-called Culture A and then superficially similar Culture B arising in the same place, and in between having nothing. He said, it sounds like a Star Trek episode, and it just doesn't work that way. Well, the official history of Egypt is actually just that. Cultures A, B, and C, all resembling each other, sharing symbolism, sharing the language, and residing in the same place, but in between, nothing. There's plenty of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian architecture in Washington, D.C., even though Washington, D.C. is officially not a continuation of Egyptian or Roman or Greek civilization. Replication is actually the way things work. People do copy older things. The Egyptians strongly resisted change. This was the source of their complete stagnation. Akhenaten, the monotheist, he tried to convert Egyptian religion from an extreme polytheism with probably thousands of gods into semi-monotheism. And he tried this and succeeded through force, but eventually was overthrown, and he and his followers were cast out of Egypt, and all of their changes were undone. The Egyptians considered their symbols divine. They did not invent new ones. And it's pretty clear that no one ever had been allowed to invent new ones. So where did they come from? The invention of the wheel predated Egypt, and yet they refused to adopt it for nearly 2,000 years until they were invaded and conquered by the Hyksos people. Why? And they had many odd beliefs. For example, they believed that after someone dies, he can live on in the afterlife. It's not a continuation of life, it's more like a recreation. And this is a painting on the ceiling of the tomb of Seti I from Egypt. They believed that these drawings in the tomb became new people and things in the afterlife, and that all their parts had to be shown. If only one arm was shown in the image, only one arm would be recreated in the afterlife. So they drew people in this odd pose, so that all their parts would show. This concept of having to show all the parts, so the thing being represented will be recreated whole, is very much like the modern idea behind the blueprint. As any engineer knows, if you forget to draw something on your blueprint, it won't get built and the machine won't work. A blueprint is a form of communication used when the people building something are removed from the people designing it. If you want people to reproduce some piece of technology without them really having to understand it, you hand them a blueprint to follow. A person building a grass hut doesn't need a blueprint. They understand the technology. But a person building a skyscraper can't possibly know every detail of the design, so he reads a blueprint one piece at a time. Is it a coincidence that the Egyptians held sacred the concept behind blueprints? The idea of reconstructing something from a complete drawing. So I'll argue that they believed that they had been handed divine blueprints for technologies. The reason they resisted technological change is because any technology that didn't resemble their blueprints, they didn't use. Something must have convinced them of this. I have no idea what it was, but something must have convinced them. But here's a simple way to show that this was their belief. This is an Egyptian sacred boat, most commonly referred to as a solar barge, and it's the boat that Ra travels across the sky during the day, called Manjet, and through the underworld at night, a different boat called Mesektet. But if anyone has ever built a boat, designed a boat, you'll realize that this is a terrible design for a boat. It's not a design that would have evolved naturally. The purpose of a boat is to keep water out. It has to also keep the waves out, and it has to keep from tipping over. The surface of water is flat. And so, the top of a boat hull is normally flat too, because the waves are all at pretty much the same height. The Egyptian boat is not flat. Anybody who owns a boat knows that boats are expensive and need a lot of maintenance. So keeping the material the boat is constructed from to a minimum is very important. The high prow and stern of the sacred boat is seen in cave art deep into the Stone Age around the world. The high prow and stern serve no obvious purpose. They're ornamental. And so another aspect of the boat keeping water out is that it needs to be stable. It needs to not flip over. But this boat is barely touching the water, and it's extremely top-heavy. It would be highly unstable. So it has terrible carrying capacity, it's wasteful of resources, would have high maintenance, and it's not the kind of boat design that would evolve naturally. But it wasn't just a sacred ideal boat. It wasn't just a symbolic boat. Egyptians also built model boats using this same sacred shape. And since this was a civilization along the Nile River, it would have been primarily a river boat, and the design is absolutely terrible. River boats are very flat because there aren't any big waves on a river. If you look at a barge, it's long, very flat. The side of the boat hardly rises above the water. So why would they build model boats in the same terrible shape? And it wasn't just model boats that they built in this terrible shape. Here is the giant boat found in the large pit beside the Great Pyramid, attributed to the pharaoh Khufu. It shares this outrageously bad sacred design, and it's been put into practice for a real boat. Now, it has very clever construction. It's held together not by nails, but by ropes. All these boards are very well fitted together, and they're tied together with rope. When you put this boat in the water, water makes the rope shrink, but it makes the wood swell. And this differential expansion tightens the entire structure. So imagine your eye at water level. You'll notice that most of the hull is out of the water. It wouldn't even get wet, especially on a river. You'd have to have people pouring water on this boat just to keep its structure taut. You know, as soon as it becomes loose, all the structural rigidity of the boat goes away. Egyptians were determined to make their technology resemble their symbols. They believed that their symbols were technological blueprints. They tried their best, but they didn't know what the blueprints really meant. So what else did the sacred boat do? Well, unboat-like things. For instance, sailing through the sky. Here it is shown held aloft by the air god Shu on the left. It's also conflated with the headrest symbol, another piece of sacred technology. Egyptians didn't use mattresses and pillows. They slept on flat boards and used a specially shaped stand, shaped like this, to support their head. The headrest symbol is actually the darker portion of the solar boat on the right. There's no conventional explanation for where this belief or this symbol came from. The headrest is often shown supported by the god Shu, as in the solar boat, and often on either side of Shu are shown the lions of yesterday and tomorrow, which are also seen flanking the twin peaks between which the sun is supposed to set, or actually their bodies replacing those twin peaks. So when you put your head on the headrest, your head is taking the place of the sun. That's the gist of it. The headrest / boat / lion / mountain peaks are the entrance to the underworld. So you place your head on the headrest when you're entering the underworld, entering a state of sleep. Egyptian symbols tend to overlap like this. But the sacred boat design is so bad that the divine blueprint could not have been for a boat. It was just interpreted that way. Whatever inspired the design was not a boat. So what was going on in ancient Egypt? What they claim in their own documents is that their history dated back to Zep-Tepi, the so-called first time, when the gods ruled the earth, gods called Neteru or Neters. This account is dismissed as fantasy by modern experts. So, is there any outside reference for this? Well, what did the Greeks think? They laughed at the Egyptians too, but in a different way. Here's an excerpt from a conversation between a fictionalized Clesias and an unnamed Athenian stranger who seems to have some strong opinions about the backwardness of Egypt. This comes from Plato's Book of Laws. Clesias says, "And what are the laws about music and dancing in Egypt?" The Athenian stranger with the strong opinions says, "You will wonder when I tell you long ago they appear to have recognized the very principle of which we are now speaking. Their young citizens must be habituated to forms and strains of virtue. These they fixed, and exhibited the patterns of them in their temples, and no painter or artist is allowed to innovate upon them, or to leave the traditional forms and invent new ones. To this day, no alteration is allowed, either in these arts or in music at all. And you will find that their works of art are painted and or molded in the same forms which they had 10,000 years ago. This is literally true, and no exaggeration. Their ancient paintings and sculptures are not a whit better or worse than the work of today, but are made with just the same skill." So Plato is mocking the ancient Egyptians for not having improved their art in 10,000 years. Egyptians claimed that they were a sort of renaissance of the time of the gods, which occurred long ago. Any other evidence of this? Well, Robert Schoch, who is probably now the world's most famous geologist, dated the carving of the Sphinx to around that time period, 12,000 BC. But Egyptologists ridicule his conclusion because all they find are things that look Egyptian, not some other culture, right? In order to be older, they would have to look more primitive. This is how things are dated. But they don't. They look Egyptian. Plato says they were still copying 10,000-year-old styles in 300 BC. So how can we discern the copies from the originals? Well, we can't. The most amazing artwork in Egypt is carved from hard stone. It's not only undateable, but it's absolutely immortal, especially if it's buried. If you bury a granite statue in the soil, it can be there for 1,000,000 years and it wouldn't even erode. Now, this is interesting, sort of soft evidence. Is there anything more concrete? Well, now I'll show you a piece of technology the Egyptians had that was beyond their capabilities. It's not a complicated piece of technology. This is the Was scepter. It dates back to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization, that period of at most 50 years when they supposedly invented all of their language, all of their culture, and all of their symbols. It represented the wielding of power and is often shown in the hands of pharaohs and gods alike. The examples of this scepter that have been found in tombs are made of faience, which is a form of ceramic, and some of them are made of wood. This example shown here on the left is made of faience, and it's from the tomb of King Tut. It has the head of a non-existent animal on one end, with long ears, and on the other end is a forked tail. Supposedly, and this is a conventional explanation, supposedly it was a tree branch that was cut in such a way to make the head, and it was split on the other end. So what was the origin of this symbol? I'll argue that very much like the airplane propeller representing BMW and the BMW logo, and the Roman torture device representing Christianity on the front of most Christian churches, this symbol derives its meaning from the function of the object represented. An object you can find in the toolbox of most fire trucks, and that you can buy in any well-stocked hardware store. It's called an angle head pry bar. It allows one to pry from an acute and an obtuse angle with the head, and using the fork for a low angle on the other end. It has slots. The modern tool has slots in it to facilitate pulling nails. But the slots give it kind of the appearance of an animal head with ears and a mouth. The meaning comes directly from the function. It's a force multiplying staff. It's a lever. Now, the design of a pry bar like this is strongly limited by the material that it's made from. That if you make a pry bar of a certain length, it has to withstand the strength of a strong, grown man exerted on the opposite end without breaking. And so whatever material you make it out of dictates the design of the staff. This design on the right is a modern design, and it is for that design works when it's made out of chrome vanadium tool steel with a tensile strength of around 150,000 psi. That's the amount of force that can be put on a sample of this material before it permanently deforms. Egyptians, at the time this symbol arose, had faience, which has a tensile strength of 200 psi, wood with a strength of 2,000 psi, copper with a strength of 20,000 psi, and possibly arsenic copper, 30,000 psi. And if they had used meteoric iron, it's about as strong as the steel a tin can is made out of, you can get up to 50,000 psi. Now this pry bar could be designed for a lower strength material, but it would look very different because the stress concentrates at this point in this design. If you made this out of a material that could withstand a lower stress, it would have a very broad and flat head. It would taper out kind of like a crooked trumpet. If you want to compare the levering abilities of various materials, just take a piece of copper electrical wire and bend it back and forth a few times to harden it up a bit. And compare that to the levering ability of a small screwdriver with a similar diameter. And you'll see that the screwdriver has vastly more levering ability than the copper. And this is what would dictate the design of a lever made out of copper. This design requires high-strength steel by modern standards, a material that did not exist when this symbol is supposed to come into being. It's not found in the archaeological record. The Egyptians didn't have it. The gods did. This tool design had to come from a previous age. The tools used on Egyptian buildings had to have come from a previous age. For instance, the tool that was cutting the spiral groove. The geological evidence says the Sphinx was built in a previous age, Ancient Egyptians said they were preserving a legacy from a previous age. Ancient Greeks said Egyptians were copying the art and artifacts from a previous age. Archaeologists say all Egyptian artifacts look Egyptian, therefore there was no previous age. So if you throw out the false logic, the mysteries disappear. Egyptians didn't suddenly invent their symbols, they discovered them. They resisted change for the same reason the Bible resists change. The same reason blueprints resist change. Egypt should be seen as a living history museum, more like colonial Williamsburg or a European castle town. Egyptian civilization was the afterlife of the civilization of their gods, created from the blueprints left behind. The Egyptians as we know them tried their best. But the problem with revealed knowledge is that you don't know enough to fix the mistakes, you don't know enough to correct the errors. The Egyptians got it all wrong, but they managed to make a great civilization that lasted for a long time and was very stable. And stability is probably the greatest characteristic of a civilization. And anybody who's ever helped a kid with homework knows that once you start handing the answers to the homework to the kid, they'll waste more time begging for more answers than it would have taken for them to learn from scratch. That is what people have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. That's the basis of the occult traditions. And that it's actually taken us 12,000 years to reemerge from the real Dark Age.